Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a look at the incredible and ultimately, yes, tragic life of Natalie Wood. Born in 1938, she was just this amazing talent. Her career really stretched across a huge shift in movies, didn't it?
Yeah.
Moving, pretty seamlessly from being this beloved child star in old Hollywood right into being a three-time Oscar nominee who kind of defined the more complex feel of New Hollywood.
Absolutely. And that journey is why the sources we have are so fascinating. Our goal today really is to get past the familiar headlines, the glossy stuff. We want to dig into the details. We're focusing on, the documents, the testimony that outlines her career highs, which were traumatic, and her personal life, too, which was intensely complicated. That includes some really controversial and disturbing allegations that have come out more recently. And then, of course, there's the big one. Mystery around her death, her drowning in 1981, which is still so heavily debated.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to understand how her journey on screen sort of mirrored this huge change in how American women were seen.
Yeah.
Going from that sort of innocent domestic ideal towards sexual liberation, more modern independence. But like you said, we also have to face the fact that, well, decades later, after all the investigations, the police reports, changes to official records, the exact way she died, those final hours, are still officially listed as undetermined. It's like her whole life was this tension between control and maybe freedom. So yeah, let's try life and the genesis of a child star, 1938-1952.
Right. So to really get a handle on the pressures that shaped Natalie Wood, you absolutely have to start with her Earth name, Natalia Zakarenko. She was born in San Francisco. Her family background was Russian and Ukrainian. Her father was a carpenter, changed the name to Gurdon later. But the real driving force in her early life, that was her mother, Maria, or Musia as she was known. She had this incredibly powerful ambition for Natalie's career. Overwhelming is one word for it, maybe even ruthless, some sources suggest.
And that idea of control, it started right away, didn't it? Even before she really had big speaking parts. The name change itself is a perfect example. It wasn't her choice or her family's really. It was RKO executives, David Lewis and William Goetz. They figured Zakarenko or Gurdon just sounded too, well, ethnic for American audiences back then. So they picked Wood, apparently to honor the filmmaker Sam Wood. This kind of simplifying, stripping away her background for the market. It really set the tone for how little control she'd have for a long time.
Oh, immediately, yeah. Her career basically launched when she was tiny, just 4 years old. 1943, The Moon is Down. She made enough of an impression that the director, Irving Pichel, noticed her. He became sort of an early champion, advising the family on what roles to take. The sources really emphasize that Maria, her mother, wasn't just ambitious, she was relentless, making sure Natalie was always ready, always available, which, as we know now, often had a pretty serious psychological impact on her as a child.
Yeah, that impact. There's one story from her early career that just stands out. It's pretty shocking, really highlights the mindset back then. Natalie was only 7, filming Tomorrow is Forever in 1946. She needed to cry for a scene, a really tough one, apparently. And she just couldn't produce the tears, authentically. So her mother, Maria, the story goes, she took a butterfly and just tore it apart right in front of Natalie just to get that real traumatic crying reaction on camera.
It's a horrifying story, just awful. But it does paint a very clear picture of the emotional world she grew up in. Performance was everything, even if it meant, well, damaging a child's well-being. But what's kind of amazing, despite that sort of forced trauma, is that her actual talent, her natural ability, it still came through so strongly.
Totally. Orson Welles, who was in that same film,
Right.
famously called her a born professional.
Mm-hmm.
But he also said something else, something quite chilling. He said she was so good, she was terrifying.
Mm.
And he noted she acted from the heart. I mean, we have to stop there for a second. What does terrifying mean when you're talking about a 7-year-old actress?
I think it points to this almost unnerving maturity and emotional depth that you just don't expect in a child. She wasn't just saying lines. She was somehow tapping into real emotion. Maybe, because her own life was so emotionally charged thanks to her mother. Wells saw that raw, almost unsettling ability to access deep feelings on command. Which is, the sign of a great performer, but maybe one under immense pressure.
And the studios, they jumped on that talent right away. Her status as a top child star was really locked in the very next year, 1947, with Miracle on 34th Street, that Christmas classic. Playing Susan Walker, that skeptical little girl who has to learn to believe in Santa Claus, that made her a household name. A huge child star. She ended up making, what, over 20 films as a
Yeah,
kid?
a huge amount of work. But even with all that filming, all the demands, there was still this legal structure, the studio system, trying to exert some control, a protective kind in this case. California law back then said child actors had to have at least 3 hours of school every day, right up until they were 18. So that meant stopping production, which wasn't ideal for the studios.
And what's interesting is she wasn't just going through the motions with school. She was actually brilliant. The sources say she was a straight-A student. Really good at arithmetic, apparently.
Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz, he worked with her on The Ghost of Mrs. Muir. He backed that up. He called her the smartest moppet he'd ever met. But she felt that pressure too, the pressure of the schedule. She said later she felt incredibly guilty that the whole crew was just sitting around waiting for her to finish her 3 hours of school. So she'd rush back to set as quickly as possible. Even her education felt tied to the studio's bottom line.
Okay, so moving from being that huge child star to being a successful adult actor, that's a notoriously tricky path in Hollywood. So many don't make it. But Natalie Wood, she navigated that transition with a role that became absolutely iconic.
Yeah, that moment came when she was 16. The film that really defined her image for that era, 1955's Rebel Without a Cause, with James Dean, Sal Mineo. And this wasn't just another role handed to her by the studio. This was like her first big act of professional rebellion.
She really went after that part, didn't she? The sources say it was the first script she absolutely felt she had to do, and she had to fight her own parents over it. They apparently hated the idea of her being in a film about, teenage angst and delinquency. They thought it would wreck her clean image.
Her fighting for it was a massive turning point. You can't overstate it. She basically forced her way into playing Judy, a role that tapped into something much deeper, more troubled than those sweet family films she'd been doing. Playing that character, the girl desperate for her father's approval, it instantly changed how people saw her. And bam, she gets an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress. It just perfectly captured that whole feeling of restlessness among teenagers in the 50s.
So you'd think that would be it, right? She'd established her agency, shown she could handle complex roles, but then she signs this contract with Warner Bros. After Rebel's success, and it quickly turned sour. The studio seemed stuck in that old way of thinking. They didn't quite know what to do with this complex, moody teenager she'd become on screen, so they tried to push her back into the same old box.
Exactly. They started casting her in what she later called just a string of unsatisfying girlfriend roles, often opposite their other young male stars like Tab Hunter, films like The Burning Hills, The Girl He Left Behind. She just became the pretty, often quite passive love interest again, which must have been incredibly frustrating after the depth she showed in Rebel.
Yeah, you can almost feel the frustration in her choices around then. She tries to find better stuff, like Marjorie Morningstar in 1958, playing a young Jewish woman dealing with family expectations, social pressures, trying to figure out who she is in New York. That theme, identity versus what everyone else wants you to be, it's just constantly there in her work from that time.
But the clash between what she wanted and what the studio wanted financially, it just kept escalating. She started refusing more roles, ones she felt were just not good enough, creatively empty. And Warner Bros., they didn't hesitate to use their power. Their contracts were ironclad back then.
Which led to this extension. And it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. They basically sidelined her for a whole year. Couldn't work for anyone else. It lasted until February 1959. It just shows you the kind of brutal control the studio system still had. It stalled her career right when she should have been building on that Rebel momentum. It was a really difficult, unhappy period for her professionally.
Yeah, it really highlights the difference between those old studio contracts and the more independent spirit that was starting to emerge. Someone like James Dean, he died young, became this instant legend. But Natalie Wood was stuck with these contracts. They tried to dictate everything, and they could just shut down her career if she didn't play ball. And then a film like All the Fine Young Cannibals flopped around that time too, which didn't help matters at all, just added to the professional difficulty. Stardom and Personal Reckoning, 1961, 1969.
So that career stall in the late 50s, it makes her comeback in 1961 even more dramatic. It wasn't just a comeback, it was like a career resurrection. And it seems like it was almost entirely down to one director, Elia Kazan, and the film Splendour in the Grass.
Kazan was absolutely pivotal. The sources point out that when he first went looking for her, the sort of wise old heads in Hollywood had basically written her off. They thought she was washed up because of the suspensions, the roles that hadn't worked out. But Kazan, He was a master of method acting, digging deep. He saw something the studio bosses were missing.
And what he saw was incredibly perceptive. He said that behind her public image, the carefully constructed, well-mannered young wife front, he saw this desperate twinkle in her eyes.
Yeah.
He felt she had this true blue quality with a wanton side that is held down by social pressure, which is, a perfect description of the character Deanie Loomis she played.
Yeah, and Kazan's whole approach was about pushing actors. He really made Natalie confront her own stuff, particularly, the sources say, her really difficult relationship with her mother and her own struggles around sexuality and repression. Her biographer, Suzanne Finstad, wrote that the process was intense, both thrilling and agonizing for Natalie. It pushed her to emotional places she hadn't gone before on screen. There's one scene where her hysteria is apparently so raw, Finstad calls it maybe the most powerful thing she ever did on film.
It worked. The performance was just so authentic, the industry really took notice. Big time. She got nominated for everything: Academy Award, Golden Globe, BAFTA for Best Actress. This was the moment. She fully arrived as a major, serious, adult dramatic actress, no longer just the former child star.
And 1961 wasn't even done with her. The same year, she stars in West Side Story, playing Maria, and that role fits right into the themes we've been talking about. Critics pointed out the links between West Side Story and Rebel Without a Cause, calling them both these sort of modern allegories based on Romeo and Juliet, capturing that restlessness of American youth.
Right. We should probably mention, technically speaking, while she was amazing in the role, looked perfect, her singing voice was actually dubbed by the legendary Marni Nixon. But honestly, that detail didn't really matter in terms of the film's impact or her performance's cultural significance. It was huge.
Oh, definitely. And her star just kept rising. Now, this is where we get to that record-breaking achievement. By the time she was 25, just a couple of years after Splendour, she gets her third Academy Award nomination, this time for Love with the Proper Stranger in 1963. At that point, that made her the youngest person ever to get 3 Oscar nods for acting, which is incredible. That record's been broken since by Jennifer Lawrence and Saoirse Ronan, but still, for the time, it was extraordinary.
So she's absolutely top-tier Hollywood royalty through the mid-'60s. She's showing her range, too, doing big commercial hits, comedies like Sex and the Single Girl and The Great Race in '65. And in that one, The Great Race, she even got to use her background, speaking Russian for her character, Maggie Dubois.
But even with all that success, the pressure, the scrutiny, it must have been intense. And she did hit a kind of weird low point in 1966. The Harvard Lampoon, famous for their sharp, sometimes mean humor, they gave her this award for Worst Actress of Last Year, This Year, and Next.
Wait, hang on. This is when she's at the absolute peak of her fame, multiple Oscar nominations. Why on earth would she go and accept a Worst Actress award? Wasn't that just playing into their hands a huge risk?
It was a massive risk.
Right.
But her showing up, it was actually kind of brilliant. It showed she had a sense of humor about herself, about the whole machine, that she wasn't overly precious. By going there, accepting it in person, she totally diffused it. The Harvard Crimson even wrote she was quite a good sport about it. It was this moment where she took control of the narrative, laughed at the system that was always trying to control her.
Huh. That's actually pretty cool. But that moment of defiance, it came right before a really significant breaking point, didn't it? The stress after the film Penelope in 1966 just seemed to overwhelm her. She said later that making that movie was so awful, it made her break out in hives, and she felt this very real pain every day we shot, just anguish.
Yeah, that emotional toll led to a complete reset, professionally and personally. She took a 3-year break from acting altogether, which was a radical thing for a star at her level to do back then. And crucially, she paid Warner Bros. A huge amount of money, $175,000, the sources say, just to buy out her contract. Think about that financial commitment. It was her saying, okay, I'm finally taking full control, no more studio telling me what to do, freeing herself from those old obligations.
And she used that time off to get help, right?
Yeah.
Went into professional therapy for those deeper emotional issues she'd been dealing with, probably since childhood. She cleaned house professionally, too. Fired her agents, managers, publicists, accountants, lawyers. The whole team started completely fresh.
And that gamble, that reset, it paid off big time. When she came back in 1969 with Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, it was a huge hit, critically and commercially. Highest grossing film of the year, I think. And it was this really smart, witty comedy tackling all the changes happening, then, the sexual revolution, shifting morals.
Yeah, that film just perfectly placed her right at the intersection of old Hollywood sophistication and the new emotional honesty of new Hollywood. It really showed her resilience. that she could redefine herself yet again and head into the 70s completely on her own terms. Complex personal life and disturbing allegations.
Yeah, even during that break and her big comeback, Natalie Wood was always in the public eye, often because of her personal life, which was, well, intense, especially her relationship with Robert Wagner. Very turbulent, very public.
They got married the first time when she was really young, right?
Mhm.
Only 19, back in 1957. It was like the ultimate Hollywood golden couple thing. Young, gorgeous stars. But then it ended pretty suddenly, divorce in 1962. And the sources point to a very specific, very dramatic incident leading up to that.
Yes, multiple accounts suggest the split came after Wood apparently walked in on Wagner having an affair with another man. This was in early 1961. I mean, that level of drama, especially involving sexuality that was incredibly taboo publicly back then, it was enormous news and obviously deeply complicated the end of that first marriage.
Wow. Okay, so after that, she married Richard Gregson, a British producer, in 69. They had her daughter, Natasha, but that marriage didn't last either, ended in divorce in 72. And then, amazingly, just months later, she and Robert Wagner get back together. They remarry in July 1972, and then they had their daughter, Courtney, in 1974.
Right. And this period, the 70s, this is when she moved into what a lot of people called semi-retirement. She seemed to be focusing more on being a mother. She only did 4 more movies for theaters after that second marriage to Wagner. But she did some really high-profile TV work instead, like the miniseries remake of From Here to Eternity in 1979. She won a Golden Globe for Best Actress for that performance. It was really well received.
And she was still pushing boundaries, even on TV, challenging that image she'd had for so long. In The Last Married Couple in America, that was 1980, her character, well, she uses the F word,
Yeah.
in this really frank conversation with her husband about their marriage. And the press at the time made a big deal out of it. Because here's Natalie Wood, still seen by many with that clean, sort of middle-class image from her youth, using that kind of language. It was considered pretty groundbreaking for her.
Okay, before we get to the final chapter, the tragedy, we really need to address something serious. There's a disturbing allegation that comes up consistently in the sources about a sexual assault when she was a teenager. And we have to be really careful here. Just present the information exactly as it's reported in the material we have, staying completely impartial.
Right. It's a deeply upsetting allegation. And it really sheds light on just how vulnerable young women could be in that studio system, how dangerous it could be. Suzanne Finstad's biography from 2001, which is considered pretty authoritative, it alleged that when Wood was only 16, she was raped by a very powerful, married, older film star.
Finstad cites sources close to Wood, including other actors like Scott Marlowe and Dennis Hopper. They recalled Natalie confiding in them about it. They described the assault as brutal, violent, said it left her physically hurt. And the really tragic part, according to these accounts, was that she felt she couldn't report it. She was terrified. Her mother apparently warned her about the political consequences in Hollywood if she spoke out. She was reportedly so traumatized she'd physically shudder if the alleged attacker's name even came up.
Her own sister, Lana Wood, added more specifics later. In podcast in 2018, Lana stated publicly that the attack happened at the Chateau Marmont Hotel during what was supposed to be an audition or meeting, and she said heartbreakingly that it went on for hours.
And then Lana Wood named the person she alleges attacked her sister in her memoir, Little Sister, which came out in 2021. She identified Kirk Douglas as the alleged assailant. Now, it's absolutely vital we stress these are specific allegations made by her friends and family, reported in these sources. They paint a very grim picture of potential abuse and the kind of systemic intimidation that could exist within the very system that was making her famous.
Okay, so that brings us, it brings us to the event that, for many people, has unfortunately come to define her legacy, overshadowing so much of her actual work, the tragedy of her death. At the time, November 1981, she was in the middle of filming a science fiction movie, Brainstorm, with Christopher Walken.
Right, and the context of that film is important. Brainstorm didn't come out until 1983, posthumously. Because she died during production, they had to significantly rewrite the ending. Her character was basically written out of several key scenes. And in this really strange kind of echo of her early career, they actually brought in her sister, Lana Wood, to be a body double for a few remaining shots needed to finish the film. The movie was ultimately dedicated to Natalie.
The circumstances of that night, November 29th, 1981, they remain one of Hollywood's biggest, most debated mysteries. She was on a weekend boat trip out to Santa Catalina Island on Robert Wagner's yacht, the Splendour. It was a 58-foot boat. The only other people on board were Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and the boat's captain, a guy named Dennis Davern.
Her body was found the next morning around 8 a.m. She was about a mile away from the yacht, and there was a small inflatable dinghy of Valiant brand beached nearby. which suggested, maybe she'd been trying to use it for some reason. The autopsy that followed revealed some really critical but also ambiguous details.
Yeah, the findings. They noted bruising on her body and arms, and also an abrasion, like a scrape, on her left cheek. But the initial report couldn't say for sure exactly how or when those injuries happened, and adding to the complexity, her blood alcohol content was quite high, 0.14%.
Right. And on top of that, the toxicology reports found traces of medication in her system. A motion sickness pill, probably an antihistamine which can make you drowsy, and also a painkiller. Now, that combination is really significant medically. A BAC of 0.14% on its own causes pretty serious impairment in judgment motor skills. But when you combine that with potentially sedating medications, the effects would likely be much, much stronger. Severe lack of balance, really impaired decision-making.
So based on what they had in 1981, the LA County coroner at the time, Thomas Noguchi, he ruled the death as an accidental drowning, with hypothermia contributing. The theory back then, the speculation, was that she'd been drinking, was impaired, and maybe slipped and fell overboard while trying to deal with the dinghy, perhaps trying to secure it if it had started to drift or maybe trying to get back into it. That was the official story.
But that ruling, it faced pushback almost immediately. Big doubts were raised, especially by her sister, Lana Wood. Lana was very vocal, insisting that Natalie had this deep-seated fear, a phobia really, of dark water, something from childhood. And crucially, that Natalie couldn't swim. Lana argued that Natalie would never have willingly left the yacht by herself in the middle of the night, especially not in a dinghy.
And then there were the witnesses. Two people on another boat nearby. They reported hearing a woman crying out for help during those early morning hours from the direction of the Splendour. So you had these immediate contradictions. The official story versus her sister's insistence and these witness accounts. It meant the story just never really went away.
Exactly, and it stayed like that, officially closed but always debated, for 30 years. Until November 2011, when the whole case was dramatically reopened. This happened after the captain of the Splendour, Dennis Davern, came forward. He did a series of very high-profile interviews, basically saying he had lied to the police back in 1981 during the initial investigation.
Right. Davern claimed that Wood and Wagner had gotten into this huge argument that night. He alleged Wagner was jealous about her talking or flirting with Christopher Walken. That was the trigger, according to Davern. And then, crucially, Davern alleged that after Natalie went missing, Wagner stopped him from taking immediate action. Said Wagner specifically told him not to turn on the searchlights, not to call the authorities right away.
And Davern didn't stop there. He escalated his claims over time, eventually saying he believed Wagner was actually responsible for her death. He gave this really explosive statement to CBS News, saying that based on what he saw and heard, it looked to him like Wagner had shoved her away and she went overboard.
It's important to point out here that Robert Wagner's own story shifted over the years, too. Back in '81, he denied any argument. But later, in his 2008 memoir, Pieces of My Heart, he did acknowledge that, yes, he and Wood had argued shortly before she disappeared. Christopher Walken, for his part, cooperated fully with the renewed investigation. Authorities have consistently said he's not considered a suspect.
So, with all this new information, the official status of her death actually changed formally in 2012. The LA County Chief Coroner amended Natalie Wood's death certificate. The cause of death was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors, which was basically the authorities saying, officially, we don't actually know for sure how she ended up in the water. A huge shift.
And the investigation didn't stop there. It kept going, and police made another significant move in February 2018. They publicly named Robert Wagner as a person of interest in her death. They stated outright they knew he was the last person with her before she vanished, which essentially puts the focus squarely back on him to explain what happened.
And further medical reviews seem to add to the uncertainty about those initial injuries. An addendum to the autopsy report in 2013 specifically noted fresh, unexplained bruises on her right forearm, left wrist, and right knee. Bruises not fully accounted for in the original report. Then in 2020, a doctor who had been an intern under Noguchi back in '81 came forward claiming the bruises were significant and that they looked consistent with someone being pushed or thrown from a boat. He claimed he'd even mentioned this to Noguchi at the time. So you just have layers upon layers of conflicting stories, changing testimony, medical ambiguities. It means the question of what really happened that night is still completely unresolved. All reason night, legacy, and final thought.
You look back at her career, though, 56 films for movies and TV. That's remarkable. She really did build this unique legacy, didn't she? One of the very few child stars who managed to have a major Oscar-nominated adult career. She really was this link, this bridge between the kind of manufactured world of old Hollywood and the more artistic, maybe more honest vibe of new Hollywood.
Absolutely. Her whole professional story is one of incredible transitions. You see her go from that controlled, almost perfectly behaved child in Miracle on 34th Street to the raw, emotionally exposed teenager in Rebel and Splendor, and then finally transforming into that self-aware, sexually complex adult in Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. Her career really does map onto the changing image of American women in the mid-20th century, navigating identity, expectations. Someone even called her, in one of her last interviews, our sexual conscience on the silver screen.
And yet, as we've talked about, this intense, nonstop focus on her personal life, the dramatic marriages, that awful assault allegation, and especially the mystery surrounding her death, it really has, quite tragically, overshadowed so much of that incredible work she did.
Her own daughter, Natasha Gregson Wagner, she spoke about this exact thing. She acknowledged how painful it is that the public obsession with how her mother died has just kind of eclipsed her life's work and even who she was as a person.
So I guess the key takeaway for you listening is to really recognize Natalie Wood as this pivotal figure. Someone who learned the rules of the studio system, mastered it, but then ultimately had the courage to buy her freedom from it and help change its expectations in the 60s. Her career really did say so much about finding your own voice, agency, liberation.
But there's a sharp irony there, isn't there? And it just doesn't seem to go away. Think about it. Her early life, her career, so intensely controlled by her mother, by the studios, and now, even decades after her death, the story of Natalie Wood, the definitive story. It still feels like it's being controlled and endlessly debated by other people, witnesses, investigators, family members, the media. It's like her narrative is never allowed to just be her own. It's constantly being revised, fought over.
Yeah.
That endless public fascination, not just with her life, but specifically with the ambiguity of how it ended. Instead of focusing on the undeniable impact she made professionally, the groundbreaking work, it really does make you wonder, doesn't it? What is this ongoing scrutiny, this constant picking apart of the mystery, tell us about how Hollywood, maybe how we all ultimately treat our female icons, especially the vulnerable ones?
Yeah.
That's definitely something to think about long after we finish here.